Hi everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for the organizers for the opportunity to present. My name is Sanchit Makhija. I'm a partner with Kearney. We are an MNC which is about 40 years in India. Have been specializing in energy process industries. Do a lot of work in green hydrogen, renewables. In fact, all of my last 10 years have been based in this. Over the last 2-3 years, it has dramatically moved into hydrogen. It has directly moved into SAF and its derivatives, including green ammonia, green methanol, etc. Now, I think the question in front of us is very simple. I'll start off with understanding what is the need. Why are we discussing SAF? SAF is nowhere near to commercialization. It's going to take some time before we actually end up looking at it in commercial scale. Because transportation sector as such, and especially aviation, is a carbon guzzler. 3% of all the global emissions are actually through the aviation sector. And it's one of the most difficult ones. Obviously, there is a hard to abate sectors like a process industries, etc. But next to it, it is also one of the more difficult sectors to abate. One, because it's a global market, which has some of its elements as localized, and it also has non-standardized regulatory moves. So an India regulatory environment will be different to a Sri Lanka. If a flight is moving from India to Sri Lanka, how does that work? At the same time, a lot of aircrafts they don't get renewed every year. It's a slow fleet. Over 25, 30 years, they get renewed. So therefore, any technological changes that we are planning to do now will take a lot of time to propagate. At the same time, there are also have been technological challenges in this technology. A lot of aromatics start to play a role in terms of how much blending can potentially happen. Some of it will be overcome with time, but at the moment there are technological challenges. Now, let's move ahead, please. I think in the next presentation. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now, I think there are 4 options in front of us when we look at an aviation sector. First would be to look at battery electrics. Now, battery electrics are a tried and tested technology. We know batteries work, but the challenge with batteries is a lot of rare earth metals go into it. So large scale deployment of batteries is a challenge. On top of it, batteries are heavy. So which means that 1 kg of kerosene that you are replacing will require almost 50 kgs of batteries to be put up in the airplane. Now, one thing that is really, really costly in an airplane is the weight. So which means any battery operated airplanes will have very limited ranges. Although they would be very cost effective, might also be very environmental effective, but they are not the cheapest. And the second option is a fuel cell, a hydrogen based fuel cell, or a similar would be a hydrogen based turbine, which means a direct combustion of hydrogen or feeding hydrogen into a fuel cell to generate electricity. All of these have their own challenges. The technology is mature. There are, for example, GE, Alstom have turbines which run on pure hydrogen, which can fuel an aircraft, but at the same time, one, hydrogen is very costly. Second is also the fact that you would require operational changes in the plane for that to make sense. Because a plane that is running on a kerosene or a jet fuel at the moment cannot really move into a hydrogen unless and until major retrofits are done, which is almost up to 40% of the plane cost. Therefore, that is not a no-go technology. New planes, yes, can move into it. New planes over shorter distances can potentially move into it. So what are we left with? We are left with something called an SAF, which we have been discussing, which is sort of known as a holy grail. This is not an intermediate technology. This is the holy grail of how an aviation sector can potentially decarbonize. It has its own challenges. In terms of design of a plane, no changes need to be done. SAF can burn exactly as other fuels are burning. On top of it, operations are not a challenge. It can be stored along the existing infrastructure that the planes already have. But where is the catch? The catch is it is 2 to 5 times the current cost of a jet fuel. Second, the challenge is it does not mitigate 100% of carbon. Across the 3-4 different technologies that we will talk about, it only mitigates about 70 to 80%. Unless and until you get into really niche and really hybrid technologies wherein you capture carbon out of the air, it is 70 to 80% abatement. That is still a good start, but the technology still needs to mature to actually achieve 100%. So SAF has its own advantages that you see. I'll not talk through it. Slides are available. You can go through it together. But SAF has its own advantages. It is the fuel of the future. But at the same time, it is not 100%. So anywhere where we are looking at net zero commitment, SAF from that point of view becomes an intermediary. Now, there are some technical limits to SF, and I think we've talked about it. There are some aromatics in which 50% of blending is technically possible. Let's take that as a holy grail at the moment. There are some technologies wherein you can do higher, and we talked about, Mr. Sinha did talk about one of them. But 50% is what is a technical limit, above which blending starts making it will require major changes in the plane, it would require major changes in the infrastructure. Similar is what you will actually see in ships when you actually use green ammonia. There are also challenges in there. Therefore, if we take this 50% as a limit, there are 4 technologies that are available with us. There are a bunch of 50 different technologies, and we talked about 13 conversion processes approved, but there are 4. Let us talk about each of them and try and understand how is it that each of them is placed so that we can at least derive some logical conclusion out of it. The first one is the most mature, and on the list you will see it in the second, which is the HEFA, which I think some of my fellow people were also talking. This is hydrogenated esters and fatty acids. Now, this has been a very mature technology. This 75% reduction is what is potentially possible in terms of carbon abatement when we end up using this technology. It requires cooking oil, it requires Jatropa, it requires similar biofuels based technologies. In terms of cost, yes, it is comparatively okay, but in terms of the value chain, in terms of supply chain of actually getting the cooking oil to that, we did discuss about it, it's a major challenge. So therefore, the scale at which we are talking about for a HEPA technology is not going to be a game changer. It will be there. It will be a certain portion of our 2030 demand of SAF, but it will not be the only technology that will dominate. Then we have an ethanol route, which is also known as the alcohol to jet, which means any biomass it can actually be converted into an ethanol, including parali, including all of these technologies. This can be produced using ethanol, and then you can obviously blend it and go ahead. A lot of plants exist, technology is also mature. 80 to 90% reduction in carbon is what we can potentially see. It also has, but the challenge with this technology, it requires volumes. So which means that a lot of this technology requires large supply chains to be set up. Conversion rates are abysmal, 13 to 15%. Almost all of it can be SAF. But the challenge is the conversion rate. The technology itself has a limitation. And all of this is what we see already in the 2G plants which are operating. Then we have a technology which is the gasification technology, which is also known as the fission technology. FT technology is what we end up calling in the industry, which essentially means that you use a biomass that can be converted into ethanol. You add a municipal solid waste. You gasify it, which essentially becomes a syngas. This syngas, when it goes to the FT process, ends up becoming a mixture of hydrocarbons, which is a mix of H2 and a CO, which is hydrogen and carbon monoxide. The ratio of these two determines how effective the technology is. Essentially, if you manage this ratio well, the entire FT process becomes well, and you end up achieving almost 95% reduction in carbon. About 20% yield, 60 to 70% jet fuel optimization of it. So essentially means all of it essentially becomes a SAF, and this is the technology which UK and a lot of European companies are going forward with. This it doesn't require large municipal solid waste, but it requires the technology capex to be put up. This is a very, very capex intensive technology, which means large amount of capital upfront is needed. This is not a slow OPEX technology like other ones. Then the last one is what we call e-fuels, which is the first one in this, power to fuel, power to liquid. These are also known as electric fuels, these are also known as e-fuels. Essentially, they require RE, renewable green energy power, which is we do electrolysis of CO2, which is CO2 can be directly captured from the air, it can be captured through a biomass, etc. You use electrolysis, either you use an SOEC based electrolyzers, or you end up using with RE, or you use a reverse water gas shift reaction on the green hydrogen to again create a syngas. Similar to the earlier processes, you end up creating a biofuel. Now this technology, if you end up using captured carbon from the air, this technology reduces 99% carbon from the entire value chain, which means that this technology can potentially be the solution. But the challenge with such a technology is it requires really cheap renewable power, like a green hydrogen. It requires at the same time the technology on the electrolyzers to become more mature, which is also not the case at the moment. Electrolyzers are $600, $700 per kilowatt. and we require for this technology to work for them to be about $150 to $200, which is about almost one third the cost over the next decade. Might happen, might not. Therefore, all of these technologies, we have a mix of each other. We don't envisage any major technology to lead. Obviously, FT technologies and power to fuel will have its own challenges, but we believe the final optimal will be a mix of all the four technologies. Wherever you have the parali, wherever you have the biomass, you will end up having those plants there, wherein you will have SAF production. At the same time, where you have renewable energy, which is cheaper, like a Rajasthan, you might actually end up producing it through power to fuels. Now, let's talk about some numbers when we talk about these technologies. At the moment, let's talk about India. A jet fuel cost is about $600 per ton. This is what the technology cost is. This is what the jet fuel cost is at the moment, what a SpiceJet or an Indigo buys from an IRCL or a BPCL. If we produce the same thing through an HEPA and we convert all of it and we change the entire thing, we end up producing almost twice the cost, which is $1,200 per ton. So there's a 2x difference. For an alcohol to fuel, it is about $1,200 to $1,800. But for a gas FT, it is about $1,600 to $1,800. So which means that HEFA is already the cheaper, but going forward, what we envisage is the power to fuel or the power to liquid is actually going to supersede and it's actually going to become much cheaper than the other technology. But that does not mean that it's going to be the only source. That does not mean that it's going to be the only SAF production. There is going to be a mix of all the four because the country is too wide and the infrastructure is too wide for us to be able to say. Now, when we look at all the technologies globally as well, similar, as the messages that I was saying, it's going to be a mix of all the four. Now, why is it that, now there is going to be a major trade flows that happen. India is one of the major players in this country, major players globally, in which we envisage a lot of SAF production to happen. Not only for domestic, but also potentially for exports. This is as per the green hydrogen policies as well. In fact, this is the last slide, and I'll wrap up now. There is already a commitment for 100 million passengers to be transported by 2030 by a 10% blend of SAF, which is about 0.36 million tons of SAF that the country has a commitment on, versus a global commitment, which is about 9 million tons of SAF. India at the moment has a production capacity which is nothing, but it has a production demand, which is at a production potential of about almost 18 to 24. India does not require all of that. In case we end up producing all of that, that can potentially be an export potential. On top of it, we can also decarbonize our own domestic sector and help it in decarbonization. I'll leave you with 3 key questions. You can remove the slide. I'll leave you with 3 key questions. First is, we need to make a decision how important is aviation sector decarbonization for our country. In case it is a yes, then the second question is, how do we end up doing it? Are these the 3-4 technologies, or we will end up with having a better technology? We don't envisage a major new technology to come in over the next decade. It's going to be refinements of this technology, and if these are the technologies, which one to go ahead with? That's a question for the policymakers. And the last one would be, who will pay for it? Because this is not going to be cheap. The transition is not going to be at a cost which is going to be lower than the jet fuel cost. We might have higher energy security, but I work with a lot of private companies and I advise them in a lot of these areas. A lot of business cases at the moment are not making sense. So how will those business cases start making sense? Either it's going to be mandates, either it's going to be subsidies. Who will end up paying for it is also the third question, which is ironically the most important as well. Thank you.